Weld beads function as features in SolidWorks. You can add a weld bead to any part, assembly or multi-body part. Let me show you how to do both. Here I have a simple weldment part, and I want to weld the structural member to the plate. If I go to Insert, Weldments, there's now a weld bead option in addition to the fillet bead option. I'll launch the tool. The first option here is to specify the weld path. You can either select faces on the model or use the Smart Weld tool. Selecting faces is really straightforward, so let's use the Smart Weld tool instead. I'll click the icon to activate it. Now, click and drag around the part of the model that you want to weld, and the weld path is automatically added to the path list for me. I can continue adding edges to the same weld path, or I can click the Make New Weld Path button to start a second weld. I'll do that and create a second weld around the edges on the other side. Once the paths are specified, all that's left is choosing the settings. Each weld path settings are independent, so keep that in mind when deciding whether or not to create new paths or include edges in the same path. The first setting is the radius of the weld, and as I just mentioned, you can get a different radius for each of the weld paths if you like. You can use the tangent propagation settings like you've seen with fillets and other features to further control the weld path. You can activate the From and To Length checkbox, along with the spin boxes if you don't want the weld to extend across the entire edge. As you adjust the values here, notice the preview updates to show the adjusted path. You can also activate the Intermittent Weld checkbox to create gaps along the weld. I'll select the other weld path and make that an intermittent weld. You can choose to specify either the gap length or the pitch along with the weld length. There's also a staggered checkbox which will create an alternating or staggered gap pattern if you're creating an intermittent weld on two parallel sides of the path. All that's left is defining the weld symbol. I'll click the icon, and the weld symbol dialog box appears. The options you have here depend on what drafting standard you're using, along with the selections you've made for the weld path and size. I'll keep it simple and just add a seam weld symbol. When I click OK, you can see the weld symbol appears in the graphics area. I'll define another weld symbol for the second path. To finish up, just click the green check and the welds are added to the model. Notice that there's also now a weld folder in the Feature Manager tree. I can expand it and you can see the two welds we just created. The welds are organized and grouped together by size. You can right-click one of the sizes and choose Properties to edit the properties for all of the welds contained under it. Here you can enter a material, a mass per unit length, cost, and so on. Keep in mind, though, that although the welds are features, they behave in a manner similar to cosmetic thread callouts. They have no mass properties in the model, so adding welds to your models is for representation purposes only, and the model's mass properties will be slightly lighter than the real-world values. However, you can see the evaluated values on the right here, and you can use those to estimate the total mass by adding these values to the mass properties of the model. If you expand the weld further, you can edit the weld bead feature itself, along with the path and symbol by right-clicking on the weld bead and selecting Edit Features. Let's look at an example in an assembly. You'll see it's largely the same. The welds are added as an assembly feature instead of a separate individual component. Here I have a simple structural assembly, and I'd like to weld these two structural pieces together and seal up this gap here. I'll launch the Weld Bead tool from the Insert, Assembly Features drop-down menu. This time, I'll select the faces individually instead of using the Smart Weld tool. You can see the path develop. The rest of the process is identical to what you saw a moment ago, so I'll just define a weld symbol really quickly. And click the green check. When I do, you can see the weld folder appears in the Feature Manager and the weld has been created.